Greetings, fellow quitters, and welcome back to the Command Q podcast. We're your hosts. I'm John Pelfrey.
And I'm Murray Casey.
They say the only two true inevitables are death and taxes. We did an episode on money a couple of weeks ago, so now we're diving into the other one. If you're someone who has a hard time thinking about your own mortality, or you're part of a family that doesn't exactly welcome those conversations, we have a guest today who will help us get a little more comfortable with life's impermanence. Please welcome Aude Broos. This is going to be a rough warm-up question because it's hard to warm up into this conversation. But what do we get wrong about death? What's something that like the public or people in general just kind of get wrong about it in the process?
What a great question. And thank you for having me. I think my warm-up answer to that would be that we make it taboo. We make it a thing that we're not supposed to talk about, especially in the West, where we place huge value on vitality and youth and productivity. We really tend to ignore death, pretend it doesn't happen, or avoid the subject at all costs. And I really think that we lose a lot when we do that because we amplify the fear that each of us might feel inside of us. It's perfectly human and normal to be afraid of death. I certainly am. Many of us are. But not talking about things is a guaranteed way to make it feel even scarier. But also we isolate ourselves and each other, I think, and especially folks who are, facing the end of life or who are supporting a loved one through that, who are experiencing grief. So much isolation that comes from ignoring the topic or not going there. And I have found that it is so preferable to stumble our way awkwardly through these conversations, even if it's uncomfortable and weird and we might say the wrong thing. Not that there's ever a wrong thing to say. It's so much better and more human to do that than to just ignore it altogether, is my perspective.
Yeah, that's nice. So, and we're going to back up just a tiny little bit. We're just curious, what was your first sort of encounter with death, or how was it explained to you as a child? Because this is, I think, where everything starts for a lot of people is like, your first pet dies, or, you flush the goldfish down the toilet, or whatever it is. How was that explained to you as a child?
That's a great question. I actually don't have a clear, specific memory. My family, I come from a family of highly practical people, not very spiritual. There was never religion in my upbringing. So I think the way that I conceptualized it was that death is just the end of things. There was never much conversation about, what happens when we die or where do we go, because I think my family is very much, because they're not spiritual or religious, don't like to pretend that they know, because nobody knows, right? We all might have our different spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs, of course, but the truth is that no one's ever gone there and come back again, at least not to my knowledge. And so my understanding of it, I think, growing up was always that was somehow the end of things. I didn't spend a lot of time imagining what happens after, if I'm being totally honest.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's in stark contrast to the way I grew up. My dad is a Baptist minister. And so it was kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. Like, funeral services were something that I was aware of and knew about from a very young age. And it was kind of always a topic of conversation because when you're in that religious world and community, a big part of that is the life after death conversation. That's what sparks a lot of people's beliefs in any number of different religions. So it's interesting to hear it from the other side.
Yeah, it is. I also grew up religious and with a family that was religious, but it's interesting too, because on my side too, it's like, we didn't talk about death. And I had a childhood friend that passed away between the summer of 6th and 7th grade. So that was the first funeral I went to. And I mean, it's like burned in my brain to like see him in the casket at the funeral, but nobody talked to me about it. Nobody was like, how did that make you feel? Let's process. It was just like, whoop, we just went and it's over and we're moving on. Like, it was not talked about. And I remember feeling like really kind of like, shouldn't we be talking about that? Like, very confused. And so I do think that that's something that, especially the generation that we grew up in, where you just don't talk about hard things, but you don't talk about death. And especially a situation when a child passes away.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good thing to remember, is that we have to be talking about things because, again, it's inevitable, right? It's part of the lives we live in.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background and why you're sort of in the process of becoming a death doula and what that means. What is a death doula, and what sort of got you to the point where you thought this would be a subject of interest to you?
Let me start by answering the second part of your question. What is a death doula? Because I had never even heard of this until about a little over a year ago. And many people haven't heard it either. And then I'll talk a little bit about my journey toward getting trained. A death doula is someone who offers non-medical support to people as they're navigating the end of life and to their loved ones. And that can look like emotional support, logistical support, practical, even sometimes spiritual. And they do this in a variety of ways that can be as simple as holding space or offering presence, during hospice or at the end of life. It can look like facilitating conversations between family members. It can look like helping folks navigate decisions about their care, how they want to make that transition, connecting them to resources and information to make empowered decisions about their wishes for the end of life, but also the extremely practical and logistical elements of helping people get their affairs in order, so to speak. The teacher that I'm training with, Alua Arthur, who founded a wonderful organization called Going with Grace, she uses the phrase that death doulas are here to help people answer the question, what must I do to make peace with myself so that I may live presently and die gracefully? Which is not a small question.
Wow. Yeah. That's going to take me a little while to process.
And different people have completely different answers to that question. For some people, it's really about emotional and relational work and really feeling that they're healing their relationships or leaving a positive impact on the world. For some people, it's much more logistical. It's really, helping themselves feel present by making sure that their affairs are in order and they have a sense of peace of mind, and that they're going to leave behind, minimal burden for their loved ones. And for some people, it's practical in the more physical sense. It's about making, empowered decisions about their health care, considering what they may or may not want in terms of care. And so they can start to kind of move through any fears they might have about the physical parts of death. And so death doulas really have a very wide range of ways that they can be supportive. And it's really about listening to each individual person and what they might need, because it's a deeply individual journey, of course. But it's definitely someone who can bring some humanity and intention to what has become, again, especially in the West, like a highly clinical and oftentimes very isolated experience, both for a person who is at the end of life and for their loved ones. Death doulas do also work with healthy people, because preparing for death is a lifelong journey. And death doulas also work with folks who are healthy, but want to make, again, empowered decisions now to prepare for death later. And the way that I came to this, which I've since learned is the case for many death doulas, is purely through a personal experience that I had. About 2 years ago, I was working in strategy and creative consulting at a job that I really loved. But I felt an itch to take a career break of sorts. I loved my work, but I wanted to spend some time resting and exploring new things, tending to other parts of my life. And so I decided to take a year off, a type of sabbatical, but I didn't plan ahead of time exactly how I would spend that time. I kind of gave myself the space to be inspired and see how I ended up wanting to spend, this year-long career break. And about 2 weeks into that time off, my dad was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, with a very rare form of the disease that typically has a prognosis of a year or less for folks who are diagnosed as stage 4. And that completely rocked me. My dad was a very, very healthy, fitter than anyone else in my family, very healthy person. Was a very shocking thing to move through. But because I was on that break, I had incredible opportunity to really move towards that development and spend as much time with my dad and with my family as possible as we navigated this moment. And so I got to be there, as we were navigating the healthcare system and decisions about his care as he was taking steps to get his affairs in order and really think about, what his kind of unfinished business was, so to speak. And most importantly, I just got to spend a lot of quality time with him, which was a huge privilege. It was much more than time that I would have spent with him in any other given year. And it also gave me a lot of space to reflect on mortality and my own emotional relationship to it, because I had the time. And when I heard about death doula work, I immediately experienced like a full-bodied, yes, I want to learn about this. This is fascinating to me. Not necessarily because I had any intention of switching careers and making this my profession. That's still not my intention. But because I saw how valuable these tools and these skills are as I was experiencing in real time, what my family was going through. And I was interested in having more tools, resources, knowledge available to me and my family, but also to the ways that in the future I could hopefully be supportive to other people in my community. Because death doula work is something that many folks do professionally, but supporting our loved ones and ourselves through the end of life is something that we all have the capacity to do. Like you said, it's the one reality that's guaranteed for everyone. We all move through it at some point. And I think, learning more about how to show up for other people during that time and in these really pivotal moments was just really interesting to me. I think it also scratched two very different sides of my brain, because there is the very kind of deeply emotional humanist side of this work, but there is also an extremely practical, logistical side of this work. And I think it kind of reflected two parts of myself that were being tickled by some of these questions.
Yeah, I can see that you would fit on both sides of that just based on your answer. Yeah. So as we start to think about this process, for those of us who have parents, especially who are reaching that age, and that's the perspective that I'm looking through it as, certainly, I'm 48 years old. It's not like it's that far away from me either in some ways, but, but yeah, there's a sort of like caregiving mentality side of it that we all have to start to prepare for at some point. And why do you think that people leave that conversation with our parents or with a loved one? Why do we leave that conversation unresolved? And then follow up to that, how can we start that conversation without it being, okay, let's sit down and talk about your death one day, which, no one is going to, that's just not going to be a way to start it. So why do we leave it unresolved? And then how do we begin the conversation?
We leave it unresolved because it's scary. It's what we were just talking about. I think it's the most human thing to be scared of death and to be scared of losing our loved ones, of course. And we don't have a lot of social codes or rituals or traditions to open up those conversations. And so it's like you said, it's hard for us to sit down and have a conversation like that when most of us have never experienced something like that or been taught, how do you talk about this stuff? And so I think it's easy to ignore it, especially because, again, like I said, in the West, we're so afraid of things that are outside of our control. And this is something that we can make preparations, of course, we can have intentional conversations, but death is something that is obviously completely out of our control, and we tend to kind of ignore it because of that. So I don't think that there is one particular way to open up these conversations or to start to introduce these topics. I guess there's two things I will say. One is doing these reflections for ourselves, I think, can actually be really important as we have these conversations with other people. So say as folks who have aging parents, an interesting way in is to actually start to do our own self-reflection of how we're feeling. If you have haven't done that kind of thinking before, I would say first starting conversations with our loved ones, whether it's a spouse, a partner, a friend, about what our own wishes might be for the end of our life and for what happens after we pass, I think helps us bring more empathy and gentleness to the conversations with other people, and also can be a really beautiful opener to say, hey, I've been thinking about this. I've had a conversation with a loved one, or I've started working on a will, or I've thought about, who I might want the guardians of my kids to be if I have young kids, if God forbid something were to ever happen to me. I think that leading by example is actually a really helpful way to open up the conversation. Another one that I think is important to remember is that we don't have to be something we're not when we're having these conversations. Like different people have different personalities and very different ways of approaching these topics. And so whether you might have a loved one who's like a highly practical person and doesn't like to talk about the emotional, stuff around it, you can approach that conversation that way and just say, hey, here's some paperwork that is useful that helps people get their affairs in order practically. If someone is much more of a spiritual or religious person, maybe it's about, bringing religious community into the conversation. If someone, is really sarcastic or funny, then bringing some humor into the conversation is helpful. I think it's important for us to just stay ourselves and stay human and recognize that we don't have to all of a sudden have these extremely stern, serious conversations if that doesn't feel right. And also that they don't have to all happen at the same time. They can be really small, incremental questions that we explore over the course of a long period of time, because it is a scary thing to talk about.
Yeah. That was my first thought, was maybe this isn't one big conversation. Maybe this is a series of small conversations so that it doesn't feel so heavy. You mentioned the way that we view things in the West. And so there's a cultural element to this too, the way different people around the world handle it and deal with it. And in the United States, obviously we think of it partly maybe from a religious standpoint, but we also think of it from a very practical standpoint too. I have these assets, whatever they are, and I have to manage that. And we'll get back to the assets and all of those questions. But I'm interested in the cultural question about sort of East versus West, or if how other cultures deal with this, and what have you learned by sort of exploring that side?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm by no means an expert on any of this, but I would say there's a combination of factors. One is that in the West, we tend to be more individualistic societies versus other cultures that might be a lot more collectivist. And that means that we tend to have that slightly more isolated way of doing things. But also, I think in a lot of spiritual traditions from other parts of the world, there is also more of a surrender to the loss of control and the fact that, we are part of one big whole. And so different spiritual traditions might have very different ways of kind of normalizing death as a part of life, because there's just a different approach to thinking about what it means to be a person and to have an ego and to live in a body, right? So I think some of it comes from the spiritual side. Some of it comes from the social side of being more individually focused versus more collectively focused. And I think also, not to get too deep into this, but I think being in a highly capitalist society, we also have this kind of every man for themselves kind of mentality. The healthcare system, in this country is, again, it's very kind of professionalized, medicalized. So death is something that tends to happen behind closed doors that we don't have close access to, versus in other cultures, there might be, again, more community around in these moments, and more people might have experienced loss and death up close just because of the nature by which they, relate to other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of happens behind like a closed door here a lot of times. Well, and I think what you said too is that a lot of times when there's illness happening, since we haven't been equipped with how to deal with it, everybody turns away. And I experienced this with my mom when she got sick, and my father too. It's like people stop talking to you because they don't know how to communicate, and they're afraid to say the wrong thing, and a lot of times they do what they shouldn't do, which is just to ignore it, as opposed to just, like you said, kind of fumbling through it. And I do feel like it's interesting that a lot of times I feel like here we also tend to focus on someone's life as how it ended versus how it was lived. And I think a lot of times in Eastern cultures too, they're talking about the entirety of someone's life, as opposed to like, wow, there was this horrible accident and we don't want to talk about this person anymore because it ended so poorly. And I think that's such a disservice because I think my mom had a really amazing life and it ended in a sad way, but that was such a small fraction of all the amazing lives that she lived. And I love the idea of like setting a plate for the people who have passed and talking about them. And I think that's why it's so important to remember storytelling and pausing and remembering because, yeah, we don't want to just focus on the very end of their life. We want to focus on how big, long, short, and amazing it was. I think in our culture, we tend to just focus on like the period at the end of the sentence as opposed to the whole sentence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's also a huge part of thinking about legacy is that, legacy can look like so many different things, but oftentimes remembering people and recognizing the ways that they have influenced us or the way that they're still somehow showing up in our life because of the way that they've shaped us is a really beautiful way to also, continue to celebrate the entirety of someone's life. I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Death of a loved one, especially, is an emotional and a logistical event. And so we're going to hop over a little bit to the logistical side of it and talk about.
Is that the left brain or the right brain?
Yeah. See, that's why you're equipped to have this conversation. And so on the logistical side of it, for a lot of people, the death of a family member is their first sort of interaction with the complication and cost and struggle of the big healthcare industry side. But also it's their first sort of like major event to deal with the bureaucracy and the process of death certificate. How do I close the bank accounts? How do I do that? Like there's a lot of things in that process that have to happen and kind of have to happen in a certain order and everything in order to get it closed up. And, we're going through that right now with one of my wife's family members, and it has taken like 18 months and it's still not finished yet. It's a big, big, long process. So what do you think, what have you found surprises people the most in that sort of bureaucratic sort of process of like checking all the boxes to show that this person has passed and everything? Is there anything that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can only speak to my own personal experience having been in a very similar place as you, John, in the last year or so after my father passed away. I think the surprising thing is that there's always more to do than you think there is. Like, no matter how much you've prepared and you think you've got it in order, there's always going to be more to do. But also that oftentimes these systems aren't talking to each other, right? And so it can be quite decentralized and it can be frustrating to have to move from different systems who are dealing with different parts of this that aren't necessarily in sync. I would say that has been surprising to me, but also actually something that's been surprising in my own experience is I have moved through a lot of this in the last year of my life with my mom and my sister. And I actually found it to be, in some moments, it made me feel more connected to them than I might have expected. There's something about an event of that magnitude that kind of forces people to be a team and to figure things out and to solve problems together. And maybe it's just the part of my brain that likes to solve problems with other people, even though it was a lot of administrative work that people have to do. There's also something satisfying about making progress on something with loved ones when you're all kind of experiencing the same loss and grief. And so that was definitely unexpected for me, but I recognize that might be a very unique experience that is not the same for everybody else.
Yeah, I think it might be. I mean, I've heard Mari's stories after her father passed, and I know that for her, I don't know how many hours of work she got done while she was on hold for different things, but that was one of the things that she brought up a lot. And Mari, I know you can speak to that a little bit, just the sitting on the phone part and just waiting and your life just sort of like passing you by while you're just trying to get the one person to sign the one thing to move on.
I definitely think it's like you have to be okay knowing that you're not going to be operating in an optimized fashion because that world is not optimized. Like you're saying, it's disconnected. And for me, my mom had already passed away. And so my dad passed away. So we were dealing with also in the process transferring guardianship of my handicapped brother from one state to our state. But then my father passed away while that whole paperwork process was in the middle of things. So then there was just all these things that were like, oh, we need the guardian. Well, he's just passed away. So there's all these things that were disconnected because we were transferring guardianship while he passed away, and then also transferring states. But I think the most amazing thing, the most amazing thing to me that was about the whole process at it. And we're still finalizing for what all of a sudden a little property popped up down in South Texas that we didn't know about. And so now, you need to open in a process and escrow account down there. And so I think it's also just like letting it go and being like, it's going to get resolved. Put whatever you need. Like I use Post-it notes, like, okay, we got that done. Take that away and take that done and get that away. But just knowing like you can't power through the process, at least after someone's passed away, you have to be strategic about letting this person needs to get this thing signed before it can come back to me. I can't make them sign it faster. I have to let that process happen and then it'll come back to me. And that was a little hard for me because I like to just let's just sit down and hammer this out. And so letting go of that process and knowing that I was trying to be as diligent and as buttoned up on my side. So when things came through, I wasn't having to do them twice. But what they were doing, I was completely out of my control. And it's hard when you're somebody who likes to maintain control, especially in a situation where it's pretty chaotic, even after, you have to let go of it, which is a good lesson to remember.
That's so true. And giving yourself grace that sometimes you might miss it, or you might fill out the form the wrong way, or you might fill out the wrong form or whatever it might look like. Really difficult things. And when we're doing it, we're often doing it when we're in a state of deep grief and we're already not feeling like our best selves. And so being graceful with ourselves and just finding support wherever we can. I think so often when people are grieving, the folks around them don't know what to do, don't know how to show up, don't know how to be supportive. And I have found in my own grief that telling someone very specifically how they can support me is an incredible gift to that person because people want to support. They want things, they want ways to help. And so even if it's something as silly as hey, can you come to the DMV with me to deal with this thing? Or, can you sit with me and play cards with me while we're on hold, for an hour, whatever it might look like. I think as much as we can, trying to make this an experience that we share with others, I think really does make it a little bit easier, even though it can still feel like a big burden.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about this on our last podcast, but when you're asking for help, you're giving that permission to that person to then ask you for help when they need it. And if we don't ever ask for help, then there's the idea that you don't ask for help. So I think the more that we can give and take help and request, the better, because it opens up when we need it. We feel like we're in a comfortable place to ask for it.
100%.
Yeah. And, we have this question here that's basically how can people who are very avoidant about the subject of death begin to lessen that fear? And I think you've sort of just answered the question here preemptively, which is it's a community process. It's a communal process. It's not you have to do all of this stuff yourself. You might have family members that can help. You might have friends that have been through the process and can provide you with some assistance. You can go to a death doula and use that person as someone to help you walk through this process. If you don't have friends and family nearby, or even if you do, sometimes it's helpful, I think, to have a third party who's impartial too. Mm-hmm. When I think about the times when I've been through this process with different family members, that impartiality piece is the part that gets missed and would really help to provide some perspective. Because like you said, everyone is going through this grieving process and we all do it differently. We also all have different perspectives on the person who's passed. Right. They mean different things to different people, right? One family member might be an aunt, but they're a mom to someone else, or they might be a brother, might be a sister, might just be a close friend. But we all have these different sort of versions of that person in our head. And it does help to have, I think, an outsider come and bring some perspective here from the emotional side, mm-hmm. but then also from the logistical side as well. Like you said, there's the practical side. And I would, I approach things from that perspective, very much the practical, like Mari, like the Post-it notes. We got these things done. Let's knock it out. Let's get this over with. I want this done as soon as possible because, that's what's going to help me with my grieving process is to know that things are closed and finished. And then I can deal with the emotional. Like for me, that would be the way I would do it is I need to do the logistical first so that I can then go deal with the emotional. But then other people are dealing with it the other way.
Yeah.
Worse.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add to that too, as I do feel like having a third party is really helpful when somebody is avoidant to the subject. Because I ran into this with my father. He was like, everything's good. I got it. You're good to go. You and Matt are good. Like I got money from Matt set aside. And I had a hard time, and I didn't, talking and be like, I need to see this because I'm now going to be caring for my brother for the rest of his life. I need to know that your version of okay is like, okay. And I didn't ask for it. And so it gave me a lot of anxiety, going into like the end of his life because I didn't know what was going to unfold afterwards. So I think if I would have had a third person in there to be like, she's coming, she's trying to come to you because she needs to know more. She's not trying to pry. She's not trying to push.
Right.
She just needs to have, she needs the logistics. Like she needs the ones and zeros to feel like she's set and Matthew's good and her family is good. And I think it would have been a lot easier coming from an extra like outside person versus coming from me. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially like you said, John, there are so many relational dynamics at play in a community, in a family when faced with these questions, and having someone who can help facilitate some really difficult conversations is definitely really helpful if we have access to it. And we don't always have access to it, but seeking out that kind of support can be really helpful.
Is that something a death doula would do, would kind of come in as a mediary?
Yeah, absolutely. Not official mediation, maybe not, but definitely is someone who could help facilitate initial conversations. Again, those very initial ones about, thinking about how people are feeling about death or how to open up these conversations, all the way through to very logistical things, coming together as a family to look at preparations together, to look at the legal, financial, healthcare system related things together. And even after a death to support, groups of people and families as they're navigating estates and making decisions together as well, which can be really hard, especially when emotions are so high.
Yeah. And I don't want to sound crass here, but the cost of death is very expensive.
Yeah.
It's a pricey thing. There's the healthcare cost, whatever that might be. There's the funeral costs, whatever those might be. And so there's a whole business around this that people it costs money. It's expensive. And so that you have the additional emotional money side of the emotion as well as the personal relationship side. And those two things coming together with a family is typically a recipe for combustion. And so that leads me to sort of one of these questions about like, how do we go about choosing things like the right healthcare power of attorney or executor or, the person or people who will play these different roles? Like, and I'll use this as an example. My parents came to my brother and I, and my brother and his wife are in the healthcare field, and I'm sort of like a business person. And so they divided up our responsibilities and said, my brother is in charge of the healthcare decisions. That's what he's going to do. If they're incapacitated or whatever, he has the medical power of attorney. But then they came to me and said, but you're going to be the executor. You're going to handle all of the logistical business sides of things. Right. And in my mind, that's the perfect way for us to work it out because I don't have his knowledge or experience. He doesn't have my knowledge or experience. I would not want to attempt to try to make a healthcare decision without his background. I mean, it's really helpful and beneficial that we have that, especially for both he and his wife. And so I feel like they have prepared us well for that. Now, we'll still disagree on things. There's no question about that. But how can people start to make those decisions about who takes care of these things before they actually get sick?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think even just thinking about it is a huge step in the right direction because many folks don't even really get to that place. And it sounds like your parents have been very thoughtful in helping you and your siblings play to your strengths, which is amazing. So I think beginning to reflect on it is a huge first step. And like you said, it's really breaking it down into what are some of the key things I might need to think about at the end of my life. And then I think you've very beautifully started to apply a framework to it, which is there are the kind of medical and care related elements of things. And then there are the other financial, legal elements of things like a will and an estate and what happens to my possessions. And, if I'm a parent or a guardian or a pet parent, what happens to the folks that I'm caring for. Sitting with some of those questions, I think in personal reflection is really helpful. And then I think it's, again, starting small conversations. Maybe it's, starting to kind of explore whether someone might be comfortable, being that person for you by starting to, ask them, first of all, if it's something that you're open to, but also starting to share a little bit about what you hope for or what your wishes are. I think there's no right way to do this, but even just thinking about it and having an initial conversation with the person is a huge step in the right direction, because oftentimes we miss even that part of things. And that's when things can get really, really complicated and challenging when the person hasn't designated people, whether it's financial power of attorney or their medical directives and advanced healthcare directives, et cetera.
How can being very clear about your wishes make the grieving process easier for the people that you leave behind? I think this is something that's really important, and it's maybe a different perspective to take than a lot of people see. It's like, if you're clear, it takes a lot of the pressure off of, let's say, me or my brother in that case. If things are left ambiguous, then that's when things get uncomfortable, I think, right?
Yeah, I think you can't put a price on how valuable it is to have some clarity, but also have those things documented wherever possible. It's exactly what you said. I think, grief is such an activating emotion that looks very different for different people, but it is a very difficult time to be dealing with big decisions when different people are involved and different people have different approaches, and you might not know what the person who has passed would have wanted. And so having a clearer sense of what they want, but also a kind of administrative baseline that helps actually facilitate what it is that they want, i.e. paperwork, wills, et cetera, it makes the burden of logistics just so much lower on everyone who's grieving, but also makes the potential for conflict and even more sort of challenging emotions even greater. And so I would say it's invaluable. Thinking about your wishes, but also really, as much as you can, preparing to have them documented. And I'm happy to talk about some resources for that if it's helpful. But there are things that aren't actually that hard to do. I mean, on the medical side of things, we've got medical directives, advanced healthcare directives, which are really paperwork where you can kind of outline both the wishes of the kinds of care you may or may not want to receive in the future. And there's actually oftentimes blank space for you to be as detailed as possible about what you believe and what your values are when it comes to your health and your body. But also actually in advanced healthcare directive, that's also where we can make decisions about, who might make decisions on our behalf if we're not in a position to verbalize decisions. So those are really helpful to have in place. Again, even if you're a healthy person, you can always go back and change them at any point in your life. So they are you don't have to worry about getting it exactly right or what if I change my mind, because these are things that we can edit. There's a website called caringinfo.org, which I find is really helpful for this, especially for folks who have been diagnosed with long-term illness or are caregiving for folks with long-term illness, because some of the logistical elements that have to get done do vary state by state. And so this is a really helpful way to get clarity on what's needed in your area. There's also a resource called freewill.com, which I'll talk about in a second, but that's also a great place where you can work on your advanced directives in a pretty efficient, short period of time and just giving you a little bit of peace of mind. Beyond the medical matters, there are then the more logistical, legal, financial element. Writing a will is really helpful. It's something that many folks think about a will being a thing that wealthy people have, but actually it's really useful for everyone, no matter our financial situations, especially being able to save your loved ones from having to jump through legal hoops when it comes to, managing the logistics after you've passed. So with a will, you can do things like decide who gets your property or your assets. You can name guardians for children or folks that you're caring for, your pets, et cetera. Again, freewill.com is a really useful resource for this. You can, in as little as 20 minutes, create a very basic version of a will, which again will save a lot of administrative burden for loved ones if it's something that you have in place. And then the last thing that is also really helpful, I think, is in addition to the financial power of attorney, which we talked about, is beneficiary designations. These are things that you might not capture in your will. So things like who are the beneficiaries on your 401k or on your IRA. If you have a life insurance policy, making sure that those things are up to date can again save a lot of hurdle and a lot of paperwork for your loved ones as they're navigating grief. The last thing, which is a little bit amorphous, is just keeping key documents as organized as possible. And that looks different for different people, whether it's digitally or if it's hard copies. And of course, you have to think about how to store that information in as secure of a way as possible. But the more you can consolidate, where you keep your key documents, everything from birth certificates to marriage certificates to social security, but also things like if you own a home or a car, the titles to those, or if you have a contract, like where does that live? As much as possible, knowing where those things are and keeping them consolidated can be really, really helpful. Of course, taking into account just the sensitivity of that information and making sure it's stashed somewhere safe, whether it's online or in hard copy. But all those things are really helpful to supporting folks who are going through loss. So the more we can do, the easier. And it seems like a lot of burden, but it is the kind of thing that if you do one small thing at a time, it can really add up and make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you add on top of that the new modern complications that we have when it comes to all of our digital accounts, our social media accounts, our, everything that we've put out into the internet over the last, 30 years or whatever. That's a whole new sort of set of things to do on top of knowing where your social security information is and your tax information and whatever. Now we've got the Facebook account, the Instagram account, the YouTube account, and then the, who knows what else that we have.
And all subscriptions that are on recurring payments as well.
All of the subscriptions and do you have access to them and can you turn them off? And all of them.
That's a good point, because I do feel like both my parents, they had some things online that honestly trying to cancel my dad's Verizon cell phone was probably one of the hardest things I had to do. It's like, do I need to drive to the headquarters and show the deaths? It was crazy. But our generation, we had so much more of a digital life. So what would be the best way to prepare that? Would it be, I guess, to have a password manager where you're here's the password to all of the things, hit the kill code and it'll erase everything. But that's something I didn't even think about, but that's really true.
Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer to this. So the truth is, I'm not sure.
I didn't even think about it until now.
There are increasingly, luckily, more and more tools out there that help us safely store our key information and share it with loved ones if we need. I'm not sure about a sort of account and password specific solution, but I have to imagine it's something out there. But verbalizing those things together is definitely also helpful. I was extremely lucky in that I had a dad who was extremely organized and got a lot of satisfaction about getting things in order. And actually once a year, even before he was diagnosed, we would sit down together and he would talk about, here's where some key things are stored and here's where you can find this information in case something happens to me. And that is he is by far in the minority, right? Most of us aren't that. So I was extremely lucky in that regard. Having a semi-regular conversation with loved ones, I think, can be helpful.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish that there was a digital service out there that was called the kill switch or something, where you could just plug in all the things and then hit the button and it would just go cancel it all.
Maybe you can start that business.
Just opportunity there.
We could or should start that opportunity. It would be nice. There are things like Delete Me that goes out there and deletes a lot of your history off of the internet and things like that. We use LastPass for all of our password management. So there are ways and tools to do that, but it is still a lot of work. Every single account you have online, if you were to go and close that, is a minimum 30 minutes worth of time, right? And if I looked at my LastPass right now, I probably have 400 different passwords stored in there across both business and personal. That's insane.
It's a good reason to turn off auto renew.
It is a good reason to turn off auto renew on everything. Don't do auto renew
on everything.
Make a conscious decision every year to renew whatever that is.
I do think that the binder, I've seen a lot more of those end of life binders and the way different storage systems. And I think, it's all of us like worksheets and workbooks. At least I do, because it helps you really pragmatically think through, and then I have to fill this slot with this thing. And I think those I've recommended that to a couple of friends where it's just get on this binder and help them start filling it out, even if it takes a year or longer to do it. But it's nice because it's kind of all those things are, for the most part, there, minus whatever you need for the state and different things. But I think they're a good starter thing. Then you take all of that stuff and you can digitize this, digital copy, but you put it in a safe and it's like set aside. So I do think that is super helpful.
Yeah. And I think there's wisdom in really thinking about one thing at a time. The more you start thinking about the mountain of logistical burden, I think the more likely it is that you're actually going to avoid it because it seems huge. But taking one small step every once in a while, I think can really add up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So going back a little bit to the emotional side of things, we're bouncing back and forth a little bit here. How can finding ways to remember people who have already passed normalize death as a part of life? This question came up in our discussion before the call. And as an example for this, I had a friend who passed away, and we had a memorial service at his house where people just shared stories. It wasn't a formal funeral. It was like part party and part like get up and tell funny stories about him, sort of situation. And it was kind of beautiful because we spent, I don't know how long, a very long time. And literally everyone there had the opportunity to share a story. And it's kind of like, if I'm designing my own funeral, that's kind of what I want it to be, and less about, the sadness of it, because we laughed more in those couple of hours than we cried. And there was certainly some crying, but there was a lot of laughter. So what are some unique ways maybe that we can find to remember people so that this isn't quite as hard of a thing?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, John. I think continuing to tell stories about our loved ones is an amazing way to remember them. And going back to what Mari said before, to remember the fullness of their life and of who they were. I think it's really supportive through grief. Some people might not be ready to talk, and everyone's on their own journey and timeline, of course, and grief looks different for everyone. But I have found that telling stories about a person who's passed on is a really beautiful way to honor the life that they've had, and also to connect with other people over this, especially when it's a really difficult thing to talk about. Actually, just reminiscing on happy memories or stories can be such a useful way to feel really connected to others in what is otherwise sometimes a really isolated experience. I think it's maybe in the movie Coco that I learned this, but I could be getting this wrong. But I believe that in Mexican tradition, where Day of the Dead is a huge annual celebration, there's this thing people say that the moment someone truly dies is when the last living person has forgotten about them, not call their memories or their stories back into the day-to-day. So I think there's something really powerful about storytelling. We did something actually at my dad's memorial that was really special. He was an avid cyclist. And, in my 3 days post his passing kind of sleepless frenzy, I decided to order hundreds actually of really tiny little plastic figurines of cyclists, and gave them out at his memorial just for people to have a little token that they could bring home. Especially kids really loved it. Folks put it, on their fireplace or in their kitchen, like as a little kind of physical memento of remembrance. But something really beautiful that came out of it actually is my dad also loved to travel, and folks would take this little cyclist wherever they were traveling to take a picture. And soon enough, there were WhatsApp groups popping up, and on his social media accounts, folks were posting and tagging him. And it was a really beautiful way for the community around him to stay connected and really feel like they were bringing who he was and his legacy out into the world. So that's been a special way to remember. But again, looks different for everyone. So objects might be great for some people, stories might be great for others. It's really kind of a trial and error, I think, of seeing what works for each individual person, community, family.
Yeah, that's a really, really cool idea. I've never thought about that before. Now I know what I want to do for mine. I know. Now, you gave me a really good idea. So, you can get custom things printed on tennis balls. So that's what I'm going to do.
Wow.
I'm going to put something on there and it'll say something like "one last hit with me" or something like that. And everybody go out and hit. That'd be awesome. Yeah, that's such a cool idea because so many people are tied to like their activities, and that's part of their community. Like your dad with cycling. Cycling is something you ride a bike with one person, but you on the bike, but you typically ride with a bunch of people, or you're a part of a club, or people from whatever. And if, especially if he's like road biking, those clubs are kind of everywhere, but everybody has that community, that thing that they do. So that's really kind of a beautiful way to remember somebody. I love that. So what is one small step that listeners can take to improve their relationship with death?
I think it's going to look different for everyone. I think the more we can approach this in a way that feels really authentic to us and who we are, the better. Kind of wrapping back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. I think if you want to change your relationship with death, you might do it in a way that feels really authentic to you. So if you're someone who likes to kind of process your thoughts alone and journal, maybe one morning you take some time to think about, what do you want your legacy to be, or what are your hopes and dreams for the life that you live, but also, what things might look like after you pass. For some folks, it might look more like having a conversation with a loved one and just, have you ever thought about, what happens after you pass away? For some folks, again, getting like spiritual or religious guidance can be really meaningful if that's part of their tradition. So it'll look different for everyone. But I think the main idea that I would encourage folks to think about is how can it be small and incremental so that it doesn't have to feel like one really, really big, scary thing.
Yeah. Nice. All right. So we've got our lightning round coming up. This is where we ask typically 3 easier, lighter questions, but these still tend on the, a heavier topic. But here we're aiming for less of a like long-term discussion and more of just some like really simple, helpful hints. So the first one is, what's the best way to start the conversation or to explain death to children? Is there a good opening way to explain this? And again, we could probably talk about this for an hour. So,
If I knew the answer to that question, I think I would be enlightened. I wish I had a good answer. I'll just say that when my dad passed away, some of my cousins who have young children, they said that he is now, the brightest star in the sky. So these kids now, every night before they go to sleep, they get the stars because they
so sweet.
Identify him. So again, it's going to look totally different for every family, every kid. I certainly don't have the best answer, but that was one that inspired me.
Yeah, that's a good one. You said you grew up in a really practically minded house. Practical answers probably fit very well, And in my household, it was, that the typical answer in the Christian faith is that they've gone to a better place. I think there is some level of comfort in that too. I tend to think of it as like rest, like you can finally rest now, sort of, because life is hectic and stressful. And so just knowing that they're at a place of rest or peace, I think is the way that we've explained it to our son. What is your favorite way to honor loved ones who have passed, or what's the favorite way that you've seen maybe other people do it? You talked about your dad with the cycling thing, but you've probably seen other people. So what's another really wonderful way?
We do this in my family for other loved ones. My grandmother, et cetera, have passed away, which is whenever we have an event and we cheers at the beginning of a meal, we name that person's name. And we say to their, it's hard to translate it into English, actually, the exact phrase that we use, but effectively, whenever there's a moment of celebration or cheer, it's kind of calling that person's name, I think, into.
Oh, I like that a lot.
Cool.
That's cool.
Cool. So you could do that on like birthdays or
Sure.
anniversaries.
Holidays, Christmas, dinners, happy hour, whatever it is, I think it just can be as simple as dropping their name when you're having a moment of celebration.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. That goes back to your sort of the topic from Coco before about like letting their memory live on. Yeah, that's beautiful. Last one here. What are some of your favorite or unique approaches that you've seen to like the funeral or the memorial service process?
There's a little bit more happening now around green burial, which I think is really exciting because, like you said, the funeral industry can be very expensive, can also be very environmentally impactful. And so it's still an emerging space, but I'm very interested in kind of the growing movement around green burial and having less of an environmental footprint, but also actually having, a beautiful tree or meadow or green space associated with the memory of a loved one, I think is very cool.
Yeah. The idea of planting a steel box into the ground never made any sense to me.
Yeah.
It's like that thing never goes away.
Just put me in the ocean and then I can travel the whole world forever.
Yeah. I do like the idea of a green burial because of that. Like my wife has talked about that's what she wants. And there are challenges. Different states allow it, don't allow it.
Right.
So this is a good other reason to sort of plan that process out ahead of time. I've joked with her that I want to be turned into a diamond so that I can live forever, like things like that, which you can do now too. It's kind of nuts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love the green burial idea because that kind of returns us back to our roots. This like industrialized sort of afterlife thing that we've done over the last 100, 200 years is kind of new in the history of humankind. I think it was much more of a green process before. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust kind of idea. So yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting. Check your local state laws. Cool. Well, this has been, it was as fun as I think it could be, but it's such a heavy discussion to have, but it's an important discussion to have. So I'm going to use the word enlightening. It's been a very enlightening conversation. And I really appreciate your perspective, both on the emotional side and the sort of logistical left brain side. I think that sounds like it served you well in your own personal life and that you're going to be able to help a lot of people, hopefully, with that process. Thank you so much today for sharing your story and for everything that you're doing in people's lives around you.
Thank you so much for having me and for opening.
Yeah, so great.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Aude.
Yep. Thanks so much. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
All right. We're back after a few days and we've had some time to digest our conversation with Aude. Mari, what was your takeaway from this conversation? I thought it was really interesting and kind of hard to think about, but also really, really important.
Yeah, I really appreciate her sharing and being so vulnerable and honest. And I think it was it was a heavy conversation, but I also think it was also lighthearted and just smart to think through things from a logical standpoint. I think like the logic and the emotion being tied together in this scenario, this situation of death, I think is one we have to talk about. So my takeaway was definitely just what she's saying about making sure that you're talking about death early, that it's part of the conversation. It's not something that you wait until the very end. And I think we all shared our stories of how we grew up with it, not being shared and talked about and kind of being, talked about at the very end when it's the hardest time, not putting off that conversation around end of life stuff when it's the most stressful, because it's so hard and it's unfair to have those big conversations when you're under emotional stress. I'm really just trying to attack the logical operational process stuff as early as possible. And I thought that was really important to highlight. What about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about it from the community perspective and the support perspective. I think a lot of times people go through the caregiving process of taking care of a loved one kind of on their own and they get isolated. When we were talking about, sort of asking for support from other people and also as a sort of a friend of a person or a family member, offering some of that support or help too, and not just leaving it up to one person to manage. I think it takes a village to raise a person. And in some ways it takes a village also to help them with end of life. And to that end, the other side of this too is the idea of the death doula as a person to help you if you need that third party. They can come in and be a part of that community and also help you to work through some of the challenges, the conversations, the end of life planning, all of that stuff too. I thought that was really important.
Yeah, it's kind of similar in some ways to the role that Christina Kelly, who we had on previous podcast, with what she's doing with helping people walk the process of chronic illness. And it's such a needed role and profession. I'm so glad to see it happening in a lot of different places, but there's so much around planning and logic. And if you're not inclined to do that kind of stuff, or maybe you don't have a background in project management, but you're being, put into the position of having to be the trustee of an estate or whatever, it's like all of a sudden you're having to assume that, like using a death doula to manage the logistical side as well as the emotional stuff, I think is such an amazing needed role. And you're right. I think the community side of things is super, super important to get early. It's also just really great to talk about openly. I think you and I talked about how we grew up where, death was part of what we knew was around us. But for me personally, it wasn't a part of conversation. It was just like, it's going to happen eventually, but it's not going to happen to us. I don't know. And so I think the more we can talk about those hard things and how to get it and the supports, it's like we're giving our kids and our friends and our community, they don't have permission to talk about those things. I think the more we can talk about it, the better.
Yeah, it's interesting. These things that were taboo when we were younger, you never talk about finances, you never talk about any of that stuff. You don't talk about death, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about, I mean, I don't know what people used to talk about. I guess sports and the weather. It is interesting to see how those conversations have evolved and changed over time and how we've sort of realized that just sweeping stuff under the rug maybe isn't the best way to handle all of these complex, challenging issues. Maybe we should talk about them, and maybe we should, find support. That's something I think having the conversation around healthcare and death, but then also finances and some of the other pieces. It comes down to like we should build a community of people that we feel like we can have these conversations with, and everything. It doesn't have to be a surface level. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. Life isn't our Instagram reel. So, what are we gonna quit based on our conversation?
Yeah, I thought one of the things just after reflecting on our conversation with her was like, because I've dealt with, after my parents had passed away, the estates and the process, and I still have boxes of old bills and things that are just waiting here for the estate to finally close years later, where I can finally shred them. After going through kind of that with both of my parents and seeing some of my friends go through it, it's like, I'm trying to think of the perspective of like, what do I want to leave my kids with or my husband with to deal with if I passed away? And so being prepared early and just kind of putting it in their case and in their camp of like, what would they be forced to take on? And like, what can I set them up for that's easy as it can be? And so I really want to quit putting off getting things better organized, because it's easy to do. It's like, oh, I'll do that next week. I'll do that next month. I'll do that next summer. I'm still young, but I think it's basically talking to her like, we got to do that now. And it doesn't have to be all at once. It can just be these small incremental things. So I'm going to quit waiting to get those things more organized.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. And that one goes along with, like the digital clutter in our lives and using a tool like LastPass that we had from that conversation as well. With Evan, I think whatever that clutter is in your life, go ahead and start cleaning that up. And then at the same time, start the planning process on the assets, the finances, your healthcare plans, all that. There's never a time that's too early to plan for that. But we all want to live forever. So I'm probably not going to die till I'm like 170 or so, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that's based on my health score from my health app. I got another 100 years. It's easy.
Even Walt Disney will be frozen side by side.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I'm going to quit isolating those who are facing the end of life, either from the caretaker perspective or people that I know that are sick. I know sometimes it's very easy to avoid that situation. It's very easy to kind of back away and just be like, that's your thing now. I'm busy doing other stuff. And it also doesn't mean that I have to take on an active role in like the day-to-day caring of a person or whatever. I could just be there as a support. I could be there to do some simple things or just to listen. I am a fixer by nature. And so I think this is just a bigger life thing. I would do better to just lend an ear and let people talk. And I think in these types of situations, that's one of the things that I've learned from Aude and from other people. Just let people talk. Don't try to fix it and just be there for whatever they need from that perspective. And then if there's a way that you can help beyond that. And sometimes, in good Southern tradition, that might be to make a casserole and take it to their house. You never know. I remember as a kid, every time somebody got sick in my family, it's a wonderful thing. It could just be the flu. And then there'd be 4 neighbors bring over dinner. And it was, This is great. This is wonderful. My mom didn't have to cook for 3 nights. That's great. So what about starting? What are you going to start?
We talked a lot about the difference between Eastern and Western and our perception of death and the passing. And, I think I liked when we were talking about the non-conventional ways that people are remembered, and that she brought up how whenever they do a cheers, that they always say the person's name. And I really like that. And my mom passed away on the 22nd of May, and we had the 22nd of May. We always called it Make a Memory Day. And we would do something on that day that would be like either remembering her or like something just be getting margaritas because she loved margaritas. But when it was that day, I did that. I was like, cheers to Debbie Thrall. And I thought that was a really smart way to add memories of people in throughout. You can do it at any point. There doesn't need to be like a special time. So I liked those mentions, whether it's like setting the plate for somebody. And we talked about, doing the cheers and doing those different things. I think it's really cool because I think sometimes when people pass away in a way that's really hard, like an illness or something like that, it becomes harder to remember them because you tend to remember the last time you saw them or the last couple of times. And it's like I've been trying to remind myself that it's not so much about how someone passed away, but it's about how they lived, and that their entirety of their life is so much bigger and fuller than the last 5 months or 5 years or whatever it was. And so it's like trying to change that thought and think about the lives they lived and not how they ended. And so I thought those things that she brought up, I thought were really good things for me to like try to put into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, culturally in Mexico and in Central America, they have the Day of the Dead, which is not something that we do here in America very much, but it's at least an annual opportunity to remember people that you love and that have passed on. And but I like your idea too, use her birthday as a time to do that, or some other big date or anniversary or whatever it is. It is easy to get caught up in just the years going by and the time going by and that person's memory sort of fading as time goes on. So that's a really wonderful sort of idea and plan. I think I'm going to start having little conversations. I'm going to incrementally have the small little conversations about my own planning and about my parents' planning. We've sat down and had some of those conversations before, but it's not something you need to, you don't have to have like one big one and then it's over. Life changes and experiences change and healthcare changes, finances change. My son just turned 18. So in theory, I no longer need someone to care for him. If something happens to me, in theory, he can do it on his own. I'm not sure if he can or not, but I mean, I love him, but he's still a little young. 18's very young these days. But that is a life-changing event. It's a circumstance that requires me to like rethink a few things about our estate planning. And also, just generally starting to have those conversations with him. I mean, I'm not even 50 years old yet, but again, it's always a good time to start to have that conversation and to tell him things like, here's where my last pass information is. Here's the basics on where you can find the will and where you can find the car titles. Like he has no idea where any of that stuff is. So it's little things like that. It's like, I mean, we have it all filed away and it's organized, but it's organized based on like my organization and my wife's organization. It's not necessarily like if he went digging, he might get lost. Which, even having those little conversations and just saying like, okay, here's the filing cabinet. Here's where the stuff is. Here's how it's labeled, in case you ever need it.
Yeah.
Wow.
The sooner the better. Then it's really just updating and maintaining. But I do feel like, I think the nice thing with talking to Aude is she had a really unique perspective on working as a death doula, being in that process of understanding that role, but then also going through her own process with her father. She seemed to be a really good combination of both the logical thinking and thoughtful side as well as the emotional side. I think that's a situation we'll all find ourselves in. So it's like the sooner that you kind of start having those conversations and preparing, then it just softens a time that can be really hard for a lot of people. So I think it was a good conversation.
Yeah, definitely a good conversation. And one that is important for all of us to think about and consider. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. And we've kind of gone around this thing a few times now. So thanks to everyone who's listened and made it this far in this conversation. Thanks to Aude again for coming and sharing her story and sharing, what motivated her to get into this and why it's so important. And just her general perspective on it, I thought was just really wonderful. We're going to link to some of the resources that she shared and she talked about in the show notes. So please make sure to check that out if you're interested. And until next time, I'm John.
And I'm Mari.
And we're reminding you that quitters can win and winners can quit. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Command Q or Uncompany.